Hi friends, how are you today? My name is Katie. This is Life Between Words. Welcome to my channel. If you've never been here before, I mostly talk about books, although I'd like to include other things every once in a while. Never seem to, because mostly my life revolves around books and my kids. But anyway, today I want to talk with you about the books that I read in November. Yes, so I read 6 books in November, which was pretty good. 2 of them were quite long nonfiction. I did expect to read more nonfiction than I did, but I'm really happy with the 2 books that I read. They were both incredible, like just really, really, really good nonfiction books, but we'll get to those in a minute. First, I want to talk to you about the other books that I read, which all happen to be middle grade. Is anyone surprised? I mean, if I'm reading some really heavy nonfiction, I wanted to break that up a little bit with middle grade because that's just the perfect combination. Like nothing too heavy on top of my heavy nonfiction reads. Although I take that back because some of the middle grade that I read was actually heavy in terms of content. One book in particular. We'll get into that. I'm going to go through my middle grade and then I will talk about the nonfiction books. So, you know, just skip ahead if you're not interested in middle grade. But you should be because it's great and middle grade is not just for middle graders. All right, the first book that I read is the last book in the Penderwicks series. It's called The Penderwicks at Last and it's by Jean Birdsall. The Penderwicks is one of my favorite series and one of my favorite families, one of my favorite fictional families. I love the Penderwicks. There are 4 original Penderwick sisters, but now there are the 4 Penderwick sisters and their little stepbrother and their youngest half sister. This book follows the youngest Penderwick sister, whose name is Lydia. The first book of the Penderwicks takes place at a manor house on the East Coast called Arundel, because, you know, manor houses have to have names, right? And this one is named Arundel. And then in this last book, the Penderwicks all return to Arundel because the oldest Penderwick sister, Rosalind, is getting married. So obviously, most of the Penderwicks have grown up except for Lydia, who is, I think she's probably like 8 or 9 in this book. A lot of people don't like this book as much as the other ones because we're not following the older siblings who we've gotten to know and love so well in the previous books. That didn't bother me so much. I thought Lydia was really endearing, and I love to follow characters, the lives of characters that I love, into adulthood because I always want to know what happens to my favorite characters. And of course, that includes the Penderwicks because I want to know what happens to this beloved family as time moves along. Yeah, so I really enjoyed this. These books are so sweet. The family is so wonderful. I love every single person in this family. This book series is such a treasure and one that I will for sure return to in my life because I love the Penderwicks so much. This month I also read a book called Macy, Macmillan and the Rainbow Goddess. And the reason that I picked this book up is because my friend Amanda from The Curly Reader, who is another middle grade lover, middle grade book lover, she suggested that I read this. She knew that I'd enjoy it. This book has won a lot of awards, including a Minnesota Book Award. And I'm not sure if it's because Sherry Green, the author, is from Minnesota. I really don't know. But anyway, this book has won a lot of awards, and for good reason. It's written in verse, so this is a middle grade novel in verse, which is always fun to read, and it goes very quickly. I think I read this book in about a day. It follows a deaf girl who is dealing with, she's very upset because her mother is getting remarried, and they will be moving out of their house, and she's very attached to her house. She also is struggling I think she's in middle school, and she's struggling in school because she's deaf, and a lot of kids don't know how to communicate well with her, and so she's dealing with some anger. One of the things I love about this book is like a trope that really gets me every time. In the main crux of this book is this friendship between this young girl named Macy and her elderly neighbor whose name is Iris. And Iris doesn't speak sign language, but they do learn how to communicate. And one of the ways they learn to communicate with each other is through books and reading. And one of the books that they delight over together is Anne of Green Gables, which is another surefire way into my heart, because Anne Shirley is my favorite character, is my favorite redheaded girl in the world. I love Anne, so any book that includes Anne of Green Gables is a surefire way to, capture my heart. I will say that there were some threads that remained untied at the end, and I don't mean that they were left untied in an intentional way, because I think that sometimes there is value in that. But in this book, it felt like a missed opportunity to explore some insight and really plumb the depths of things that could be plumbed. And one of those things was Anne of Green Gables. They talk about Anne of Green Gables, and they talk about some other books that then they really plumb the depths of, this mutual love for these books. But with Anne of Green Gables, they talk about Anne, and you know that she's reading Anne, and then it's never returned to. And I feel like that was a really missed opportunity because of the way that other books were talked about and other moments. I don't know. There was just something that felt a little bit amiss. So while I loved the sweetness, I loved the friendship between this little girl and this older woman, I really appreciate stories like that. I love that trope, which I already said. But yeah, I feel like there was just something a little bit missing. So I gave this 4 stars, not 5, because of that. But I'm so glad I read it. It was wonderful, and I'm really glad to have it on my middle grade, as part of my middle grade library. I also read this month the 3rd book in the Morgan Crow series. It's called Hollowpox, The Hunt for Morgan Crow, and it's by Jessica Townsend. I love this series. I've talked about this series before on my channel, for sure on my Instagram account. This series follows Morgan Crow, who is, actually, I'm not going to say who exactly she is, especially by this 3rd book, because that will reveal too much from the previous books. But I will say that these books get better and better the further along you go in the series. This is the latest book, so there's only 3 books, but I do think that there's going to be quite a few. Like, I want to say there's going to be 9 books in this series. It's a lot. Our main character is Morgan Crow. She starts out as an 11-year-old girl who is cursed, and she is whisked away into this wondrous, that is a pun, because wonder is an element, like a magical element in this world. Anyway, she is whisked off to this world of wonder, to a land called Nevermore, a wondrous land called Nevermore. In this book, so in Nevermore, there are animals that are called wonimals. And wonimals are basically animals that can talk and think they're very sentient and intelligent. They're part of society in the way that every other human being is part of society. And in this book, the wonimals, there is an epidemic that is affecting only the wonimals in Nevermore. I can't wait for the next book to come out. This series is just so special and magical and transportive. I really love it. The last middle grade novel that I read is a favorite from this year. It was incredible. It was also really challenging. That book is Fighting Words by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley. This book tackles the issue of sexual abuse to a child. And so I would not say that this is a book for every middle grade reader. But I will say that the way that Kimberly Brubaker Bradley talks about this issue, handled this topic in a book for middle school or middle grade readers, was incredible. She did it with such sensitivity, such empathy and love and grace and finesse. It was very nuanced and hopeful. I think that, like I said, I would not hand this book to every middle grade reader, but I will say for middle grade readers who do pick this up, especially, it would be especially worthwhile, I think, if they read it with an adult, And I think it's so important for kids to see that they're not the only ones. I think that when you're talking about an issue that's as sensitive as this, so many kids who are in this situation feel alone and isolated and like they're the only ones. Reading a book in which the main character and her family, her sibling, is dealing with this would be so cathartic, so revealing, so important. I'm just gonna say there's definitely some content warnings for this book, because not only does it touch on the issue of sexual abuse, it also touches on mental health issues like depression, suicide attempts. Like, it is rough, but it is also incredibly well done. I wouldn't hand this to a young middle grade reader. I would definitely hand this to an older middle grade reader, and also adults. Like, this book is incredible. One of the things that I love about Kimberly Brubaker Bradley's writing is the nuance that she takes, especially in her characters. All her characters feel so realistic. Our main character in this book, Suki, and her older sister Della have been through an incredible amount of trauma, and so they don't come out unscathed. They are wounded. They're wounded, and like wounded people, they can lash out. They can lash out in anger. They can be angry. They can be unlikable sometimes. You have so much compassion for them, and I want to be careful, because I don't want to say they are unlikable. They are incredibly likable. I'm just saying that there are times when they act in such a way that is not always kind. You know, they're not caricatures. These people that Kimberly Brubaker Bradley writes about feel real. They feel like real wounded people who are both lovable and flawed, and flawed because of their wounds. My other favorite character in this book is the foster mother that you meet. She's so wonderful. And it's one of the things I think is interesting is that as I was reading this book, I could really see remnants or like aspects of these characters that I recognize from Kimberly Brubaker Bradley's other books, especially, well, I should say the only other books I've read by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley are The War That Saved My Life and The War I Finally Won. I have not read her other books, although I'd love to, because she is now a favorite middle grade author, and I can say that with like a full heart because I've read, more than 2 books by her. But I can recognize aspects of characters in all of her books, just the way she writes about them, the fact that they are both lovable and flawed, that they push people away, and yet they so desperately are in need of love. I cannot speak highly enough of this book. It is amazing, but tread lightly, like I said, because the content in this book is not easy. All right, now on to my nonfiction reads for the month. I started out Nonfiction November by reading The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, which is such a fun name to say. This is about Henrietta Lacks, who is not really immortal, but she died of cancer in the 50s, and unbeknownst to her, without her consent, her cells were taken, her cancerous cells were taken and used for research, and they are still used for research today because those cells have never died. In fact, they have just continued to multiply so much that they're used all around the world for all sorts of different scientific innovations, especially in regards to, how we treat illnesses and disease. So this book follows Henrietta Lacks. We learn about her cancer, we learn about her life, we learn about her children. In fact, most of the book we follow her children, who also didn't know at the time of her death that her cells were being used for research. They came to realize that later, and it has been an ongoing fight, an ongoing battle for them to see any sort of compensation from her mother's cells, because at the time of their mother's death, the doctors didn't need to take consent. This tackles issues of exploitation in the medical field, especially in regards to people of color. It follows that idea on a broad scale, but it also follows this particular family because these HeLa cells, these cells from Henrietta Lacks, are so famous in the scientific world. And it explores issues of medical ethics, and it's complicated. And I will just leave it there. This book reads like a medical drama that you'd watch on television. It's so good. It's so readable. If you're not a nonfiction fan, I still highly recommend this book. I can't believe that it's taken me so long to read. Every year, the University of Wisconsin in Madison comes out with what they call the Big Red Read. And I don't know, probably like 10 years ago, this was the Big Red Read. And I was part of I had just joined a book club at the time. And this was the book that was chosen. Now, I think that I was coming in on the tail end of this read, so I didn't participate. And I wish now that I had just picked it up and even read a little bit. But at the time, I actually wasn't reading a lot of nonfiction, and I didn't realize how narratively driven nonfiction could be and how fascinating, how morally complex. I mean, this book is just fabulous. So anyway, Henrietta Lacks, it's so good. And then I finished off the month with another incredible nonfiction read, and that was Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon. This book follows the mother and daughter pair of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley. Interestingly, I have never read any Mary Wollstonecraft or Mary Shelley. If you are not familiar with those names, I guarantee you'll at least be familiar with one or two of their books. Especially Mary Shelley. So Mary Shelley, the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote Frankenstein, probably one of the most widely read classic horror novels ever. And then Mary Wollstonecraft, whose most famous work was actually an essay, a very long essay, but it was an essay called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Mary Wollstonecraft died in the 1790s, so the very late 18th century, and Mary Shelley lived into, almost the mid-1800s. They lived radical lives. Reading about Mary and Mary was sort of like reading, it was like this idea, sort of, that the truth is stranger than fiction, and it really was. Their lives touched the lives of so many famous people. I mean, Coleridge, Byron, Percy Shelley, more people than I could possibly name here. Those were three off the top of my head, but so many. If there was a romantic writer, whether it be a writer of poetry or philosophy, I mean, whatever, they probably met Mary or Mary, one of the two. But like I said, their lives were radical. Although they probably wouldn't seem too radical today, they were so radical at the time of their lives that they were basically outcasts. Neither woman believed in marriage because marriage, especially at the time, was awful. Women had absolutely no rights. Once they got married, their lives were completely owned by their husband. Every aspect of their life could be dictated by the person that they married, the man that they married. I mean, obviously, from a worldview perspective, I believe in the sanctity of marriage, etc., just because that's my worldview. But I can understand where these women were coming from because of how awful women were treated. But they didn't believe in marriage. Both of them had children out of wedlock. And, because of that, they were also treated horribly by their contemporaries. They were infamous rather than just being sort of celebrities. They were not just famous, they were infamous because of their radical beliefs. They were also extremely independent, devoted mothers. And actually, both of them, even though neither one of them believed in marriage, both of them ended up getting married. And it didn't really end up improving their lives a whole lot, mostly because I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft died soon after getting married, and Mary Shelley, you know, Percy was a little bit of a philanderer. So Percy had sort of a very interesting love triangle with Mary's stepsister. I mean, it was just like truly, they lived, their lives were crazy, crazy, crazy lives, but fascinating, so inspiring. This book is so well written. You fall in love with these women, and even if you don't agree with every decision that they made, you certainly valued the integrity with which they lived, because they lived lives full of deep conviction, and that is truly inspiring. And not just deep conviction, but like very thoughtful, intentional lives. I can't speak more highly of this book. It was an amazing read. It was, every time I set it down, I wanted to pick it back up because it was just so interesting. I thought that reading this book was a great introduction to their works because, you know, I'm not going into them blind. I have the context both of when they were written and why they were written. There's a lot more to Frankenstein than just about the creation of a monster in the literal sense. There's a lot more going on with that. And even the story about how Frankenstein was created was incredible. I mean, she was 19 when she wrote Frankenstein. I mean, talk about making you feel bad for the accomplishments of your life when you're in your 30s and haven't done anything nearly that impressive. So anyway, those were the 6 books that I read. I'm so happy with my November reading, and my December reading is off to a pretty good start as well. Let me know if you guys participated in Nonfiction November. Let me know what nonfiction book you read, especially if you recommend it highly. I do love nonfiction, even though I don't read it as much as I'd like to. It's one of the reasons I love Nonfiction November, because it pushes me to pick up those nonfiction books that I've been wanting to read for a really long time. Make sure to leave a comment down below. Like this video if you want to see more from me. Definitely subscribe to my channel if you're not already. I'd love for you to stick around. And I will talk to you all later. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.